Yeah, we do have another monarchist in the YouTube chat. Wolf576 says democracy is terrible. Lotus Eaters did some Vox Populars asking people what percent of the UK is black. People were saying 30 to 60%, and these people's vote is worth the same as someone not. This does not prove that democracy is a problem. As I've said, democracy is not a decision-making engine. It's an adaptivity network. It's an accountability network. You have people who get impressions of the state of society and then filter that information upwards. Now, what you're talking about there is very likely to have been significantly affected by propaganda. Propaganda can fuck up people in any political system. They can fuck up the leaders, and they can fuck up the people. The leaders can be out of touch as well. They can have no idea what's going on in the real world. If you cycle them out frequently, that sort of solves that problem. But you have other problems as well. We are dealing with the most effective attacks against democracy that have ever existed. But democracy is the most effective system that's ever existed. I'm not convinced any other system could stand up to these attacks, not even close. But democracy is not only weathering it, but slowly beginning to recover.
I was going to say, I watched the Vox Popular that person is referencing. The funniest one was them with you had to watch the whole thing to get the absolute punch, but they were asked what proportion of the UK population do you think is black? And they were guessing way too high, and they were told, oh, it's actually this low. It's 4%, I believe. And they were all guessing between 30 and 60, as the commenter said.
The crime is so insane. That's probably why.
Yeah. This is the thing. They were then asked what percentage of the UK population do you think is gay? And they were all guessing, and a few of them were saying, oh, I was too high on the other one, so I'm going to guess a bit lower. And they were all guessing 10 to 30% of the UK population is gay. And they were told 1.5, and some of them were just going, nah, I don't believe that. Everyone I know is gay. It's got to be higher than that. Nah. They didn't believe. And then the third question they were asked was, what do you think that gay and black people are under or over or about right represented in the media? And they were like, oh, no, they're way underrepresented. The representation's terrible, but it's getting better. But, they're still underrepresented. And it was like, how? How have you got this train of thought?
How can you think that there's 30% or
how could a population survive on 30% gay? It couldn't.
Not just 30% gay, but that black people as well. They think that it's that much of the population, and then when they realize
to be fair,
what the actuality is, and then
it was being asked in, I think, London.
It was remarkable to see, we have to change the racial makeup of the BBC to match the country, and then it was to match London, and then it went past London, and they stopped bothering to try and say it was matching anything, even London. Yeah, so
oh god, I just can't.
What they did there was to prove that those people have stupid opinions, and many people do, especially in London. Does not disprove democracy. The elite, as it were, today, right now, are mostly evil. Do you want evil? Or do you want people that are incompetent in areas where they have been very expensively propagandized? Remember what happened in 2016? The people of the UK voted for Brexit. When no one expected it. Trump is very popular. You gotta take all sides of this and not just assume, well, these people are idiots, therefore they shouldn't have any control. That's what the elites want, by the way, among other problems with that idea.
My whole issue with democracy is that when evil people get into power, it's they're going to do everything they can to keep being in power, which is they're going to fuck up the democracy system. It's not that the democracy is the issue; it's that they're not letting, as you know, democracy actually work in the way it's supposed to. They intentionally fuck up the system in place to keep themselves at the top over and over and over again.
Yeah,
and then when that's happening, you have to fix the system. But how do you fix the system when the people in power aren't letting anything else but themselves get into power?
Yeah, that is difficult. It's much more difficult for them to fuck up democracy than to fuck up a system where they have more power by being the elite. If you get a bad king, they can do pretty much anything. If you get a bad oligarch, they can do mostly anything. A bad democratically elected leader, there's usually very significant checks and balances on that, and term limits, and all kinds, and the public are always aware of what they're doing. It's much more difficult and expensive to be a tyrant in a democratic system. So you've already got a massive barrier to entry. What you're seeing in the modern world is an unprecedented, highly advanced, very long-term planned attack specifically targeted against Western democracies. It's as effective as you can imagine, and it's still not quite enough. We are still adapting gradually to it. And the way that you get people of power into positions to replace the evil ones is gradually, by a degree. And frankly, it's already worked. The only reason it hasn't worked more is because they have actually resorted to rigging the elections. And that is one of the last things they get away with doing.
We have to destroy the EU as well, because that's also a massive issue with democracy, because the way they've done it is that they're like, oh, we're going to include everyone in this region in the EU, right, in our voting system. And then we can then retroactively impose this on a country because we've all voted to f you over. And then the poor little country is there being like, well, actually, the people on here have voted not to have this happen. And they're like, well, fuck you, we voted against you. So get fucked. That's what's actually happening now. And many of these places aren't actually able to vote, or when the people they put in power, it means nothing. If the EU can just be like, nah, we're just going to ignore that vote because we have more people voting against what you're saying.
The EU is, I mean, like having any supranational system is going to be risky. The US works for a few different reasons. The EU does not have what it takes to work as a supranational entity. Murafaku, that guy made it in because they rigged the vote, specifically where they removed democratic measures. Problems arose, specifically and exclusively where they remove democratic measures and liberal principles is where the problems arise. It's quite instructive. And rigging the election is one of the last resorts that they can use before they really show their true colors to everyone. Wolf576 says, not a monarchist, fair enough. I didn't assume it, someone else did. Maybe I did tacitly, my mistake. He says, and the point was that the old quote holds true, the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. That's fair, but you can also make similarly simplistic arguments against other political systems. To counter that quote, I believe maybe from the same person, actually, Churchill, democracy is, what was it exactly? It's something along the lines of democracy is a terrible system, but it's the best one we have. It wasn't that. I butchered the quote, but it was to that effect, words to that effect. Someone in chat will get the actual quote, but it's not a great or perfect system. It's frankly a cope for all the difficulty we have in real life, all the inconsistencies and complexity. Monarchy and oligarchy are much worse systems despite that fact. They're much bigger copes. The complexity that we have, you can never get anywhere near to perfectly managing that. Having one single leader, a court above him, and some feudal groups is a cope for dealing with all that complexity. It's one way of doing it. It has flaws, and most of them are sort of ameliorated, fixed, smoothed over by democracy, with a few new ones added, but overall an improvement. So democracy was selected. Democracy is still, like all the other systems, an attempt to cope with the massive complexity and inscrutable dynamics of real life. It's just the best one we have. Yes, thank you, Matthias. That's a lot closer to the quote. The worst form of government, except all the others. Mofaku, don't mistake for a second that I do in fact believe that liberal ideology, classically liberal ideology, does not only permit, but obligates direct action, shall we use that term, when the system cannot be solved by peaceful and agreed upon means, and when your rights are being taken away. Direct action is not only allowed, but obligated. And we are pretty close to that point in many Western countries. Some people think we are there yet. We're not quite there yet. We are getting worryingly close. There you go. Matthias, thank you for posting that, Matthias, because he actually says it very well, Winston Churchill. He says, no one pretends that democracy is perfect or all wise. I certainly don't. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. Yeah, so it's a good quote. And that is it. Like, I'm not saying it's all wise, but I do laud its benefits, especially because so many people don't seem to understand it. One thing I have noticed is that I don't know anyone else who has the same perception, the same idea, the same view of democracy as I do. I saw someone up in chat saying, I think it was Calidrius, saying we should remove the deification of it. Yeah, if you noticed, I don't deify it. I simply advocate for it. There are people, and I know this, there are people who believe that as long as the system is democratic, it must be good. Or as long as the system says it's democratic, it must be both successfully democratic and good. There are people that take it too far. What I advocate for isn't that. And I hope that you've seen that, chat. And I talk about it a lot, advocate it a lot. You may think I think it's perfect or ideal or not just an attempt to deal with reality, but it's nowhere near perfect. It's not all wise, as Churchill said. It's just the best one we have. And not by a huge amount, but just by enough. It is worth it. Keith says, we only talk about Greek philosophers because they were first. It literally doesn't matter what system you use, as long as it's honest. Largely true. I do think democracy has a few benefits, even compared to other systems which are being honest. And democracy is a bit more adaptive to keep itself honest as well. So I would not say it's a huge difference between democracy and other systems. But democracy is the better of those systems. And the main issue I have is not that other people think monarchy is slightly better than democracy, but that they think democracy is the problem today, which is the opposite of the truth. Democracy's lack is the problem today. Exactly where it's lacking, we get problems. Also, as PMAT says, I have to clarify this every time. When I'm saying democracy during these conversations, I'm using it to include republics as well. They are a little different, but they are the same as far as what matters for this conversation when talking about republics. When talking about, monarchistic systems and oligarchies and other forms. I think republics and democracies, when they're advanced forms, they both work, as demonstrated by our nations in the world today. I'm not sure which one I think is better. The protections, the strict protections of rights under the Republic are kind of good, but it adds complexity. And it doesn't seem like much complexity, but I feel like that could be a big deal with enough time. And I think there's a lot of aspects of our republics that make people less dedicated to defending it, more willing to let it run on its own, especially in a very libertarian country where they can theoretically escape it, especially in a very large country where they may not be noticed. And there's a lot to be said, despite the downsides, obviously the downsides are pretty big, for a more collective-focused, tradition-focused, densely populated country like we have here, and a simple system of government. Which, granted, if you go into the great details here, it's not simple, but at the most simple level, ours is still simpler than the US one. House of Lords, mostly irrelevant. Monarch, in terms of legislation, mostly irrelevant. House of Commons, very simple to understand. That's where most attention should be drawn. In the US, you have to understand you've got multiple states. Each one has their own sort of semi-pseudo-republic. You've got, each one does the electing of the president. That's one of the three branches. Then you've got the Supreme Court, who do something else, and the way they're elected is based on the president. Then you've got two legislative houses, and we do kind of two, but the Lords is a lot less relevant, I think, than your Senate. So the US system is more complex by default, which may turn people off understanding it, which makes it less accountable. So this is not, I wasn't planning on going to Republic versus democracy. They're both fine. I'd be fine with either of them. But I wouldn't be too gung-ho about thinking one is obviously better, chat, even if you live in one.